Hey, Lordy, look at the time.
Empowered.
Okay, so welcome back to the M-PWRD Podcast. I've got a really special guest today. Known you for a long time, and anytime anything, I'm not going to spoil what you do because I'll let you tell everybody because I'll butcher it. But anytime anything international politics or anything like that comes up, I always go, look, I know a guy who is the expert on this. So Steve, please tell everyone a little bit about what it is that you do, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, you might perhaps slightly oversold it, but so I'm a specialist in the laws of war, international humanitarian law. I'm an international lawyer. Mainly worked in conflict-affected contexts over the last 15 years. Worked in Gaza, Mali, Myanmar, Pakistan. And also worked at a few different universities and think tanks and stuff. And now I lead a kind of a Laws of War Centre. Sorry.
That's all right.
Laws of War Centre. I lead a team of about 15 international lawyers, kind of spread around the world, and a team totally about 25. So things are happening in Gaza, what's happening in Yemen, Afghanistan.
So when something like that happens, so obviously in these areas there's conflict. What is what is it that you actually do in that sense?
So basically, I work in a very exceptional body of law. So when there's war, armed conflict, there are rules. Even war has rules, is the kind of phrase you often hear. So our role is to educate, inform, analyse potential violations of the law. So we work with media. So media, for me, are a key actor on reporting. And they'll say, unfortunately, in conflict, from a legal perspective, just because something is bad or some people are killed, it's not a violation. So we help try to inform people to navigate what the law does say, what the law doesn't say, and help to identify potential violations. And that can be for the purposes of media. It can be for the purposes of kind of briefings to the UN. It can be for briefings for members of parliament. It can be for humanitarian organisations, Save the Children, War Child UK. They're not legal experts. They'll come to us and we'll give them kind of legal advice. So as humanitarian actors, the first thing they want to do is do public advocacy. So they want to draw attention to the violations. That's at least in the hope that these violations will stop and there'll be then accountability. So that's when you lead into the war crimes discussion. Because if ever you hear someone mention the word war crimes, the first question you have to identify, well, it needs to be a violation of IHL, international humanitarian law, and then serious violations of that amount to potential war crimes. So, yeah, that's kind of what we do.
So the members of parliament, the actors, and they need to know whether, in fact, the things that are happening aren't just, part of what is to be expected in war. Because obviously, it's no secret that people are going to die in wars. Obviously, it's a terrible scenario, but then you're kind of going, no, this is actually outside of the framework of what's acceptable here. So is that just so that they know whether they can kind of make it public and say, look, what's actually happening there isn't okay? And then is it in hopes that the people who are actually committing the war crimes will then stop? Or is it more to get intervention from the bodies that would intervene if there is a war crime, if that even exists?
Yeah, it can be all of the things. So for me, the first thing, this is why it's both, I think, a very challenging area to work in, but also really not inspiring, that's not quite the right word, but law regulates every aspect of our life. My brother's a solicitor. He works in wills and estates, contract law, your business, everything is regulated. And then when you step outside of that, there'll be some consequences. Mm-hmm. Of course, criminal law, there'll be criminal consequences, but if you violate a contract, there'll be some consequences.
Yeah.
So I work in an area of law which is really about, human rights law and humanitarian law is not aspirational. It's like, what is the bare bones of things that we can expect? And if you think of war, the law that I infer, it's not the law that I wrote. I'm not some left wing, this guy, he's from Yorkshire, he doesn't know anything about war. The law itself was written by the global community after the Second World War. And you can imagine, how do they agree
So is this
on
like
anything?
Versailles? Almost sort of thing.
So you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Conventions of
Right.
the main post-Second World War framework. But so the law there for me is in a really important place to really try to protect basic human dignity. But the challenge is, despite states agreeing on these rules, they then violate them. And what are the consequences? And that's probably the biggest question we get asked. Well, okay, you've identified a violation, so what? There are mechanisms, and I can speak about them later, like the International Criminal Court. But when an actor violates the law, they themselves, it should be a self-regulating system. But you can imagine that sometimes doesn't work. Because if you're violating the law yourself, if you're a commander, and you as a commander also should be investigating violations of the law, it's a bit contradictory. So the point I'm trying to make is that this is the basic standards. It's not aspirational. It's like even in war, there needs to be some limitation on what you can do. And then when you identify violations, we're an independent actor, and so we try our best to say independently why we think there are violations, and then there can be a legal response to that through a national court system, international court system. But for us, importantly, a political response is still important. And particularly when you look at, let's take Gaza, Israel, Palestine, a highly politicized context, I can say, well, at least the law, in theory, should be an objective way to assess what is right, what's wrong.
So if, for example, there isn't war crimes taking place, so it's not a crime to just start a war with a country. You can just invade a country and that's not a war crime.
Yeah, so this,
or is it?
It's a very great question.
Yeah.
But so international law, it regulates many different things. So international regulates when you can go to war. Generally, since the Second World War, it can only be in situations of self-defense or with UN Security Council approval. So the idea is that the lesson from the Second World War is that you can't just go to war with anyone. But as you see, conflict is a factual reality. There are over 50 armed conflicts globally. So I actually...
active armed conflicts?
Yes, active armed conflicts. As a specialist in the laws of war, I would refer you to another international lawyer. I would say, I don't care. I don't care if the war is lawful, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine. I don't care, because the whole point of international humanitarian law is to say, okay, there's always going to be a good guy and a bad guy, and that will probably differ from who you speak to. And from
your perspective, whether you're the people who are being invaded or...
Exactly. So the point is that regardless of the situation, conflict is a factual reality, and therefore the illegality of the war, for me as an international humanitarian lawyer, is not a relevant issue. So for me, I work in this very small area, even within international law, even within armed conflict. It's the laws of war. Yeah. But I do work in the area where we're speaking about international humanitarian law, and serious violations of that will amount to war crimes. So that is any discourse around war crimes from a legal perspective is solely within that specialty area.
So, both countries can't be acting in self-defense because, one of them has to be the aggressor. If you're both just acting in self-defense on your own soil without, there wouldn't be a conflict. So I imagine somebody has to make a move to it doesn't necessarily have to be boots on the ground, but, everybody knows about the Palestine and Gaza, and the majority of that is rockets, right? They're basically sat in their own occupied space, firing rockets at the other people. So if you're, being invaded, you've also got a responsibility to not commit war crimes.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you're the attacker or you're being defensive, you have to respect the laws of war. And even if your enemy has committed war crimes or atrocities against you, you can't say, well, that's the whole point of the law. To say it doesn't matter what the other side is doing, you have to respect these basic standards, because otherwise there is no conflict in the world where one side is not accusing the other side of violating the law. And that would be a very good way of saying, well, let's just put the law to one side. And what does that mean? It means there will be no regulation on conflict.
So out of those 50 conflicts which are taking place at any time, how many of those conflicts are taking place between two standing armies, two kind of...
Very few.
Yeah, so you've got...
The majority of conflict in the world is between what we call non-state armed group.
Yeah, like a militia.
A militia, yeah.
Or an organisation like would Al-Qaeda and ISIS and things.
Yeah, they could be, yeah. Right.
Because as far as I'm aware, Palestine don't have an army.
No.
But obviously there's the organisation in Palestine.
You've got, it's complicated, but you've got a series of armed groups in Palestine. Hamas is
the main
one, but you've also got Islamic Jihad and other militant groups, mainly located in Gaza.
So if they're not a country's army, then who's kind of holding them accountable? Because I would imagine that they probably have never agreed to those rules. So it's kind of like, it's not a boxing match. You know, if somebody gouges someone's eye out in an MMA fight, there's been an agreement that at the start of this fight, you know, no eye gouging, no head stamping. Do you know what I mean? There's rules, and both of those fighters have got into the cage. They've closed the cage and they've agreed on those rules. Yeah. Now, with this, it's kind of like you've got these armies and you've got these countries like Israel who are part of, you know, are they part of the UN? Yeah, they're part of the UN. Yeah. So you've got Israel.
And they're signed up to the Geneva Conventions.
America, which is part of the UN. But then you've got these militias, these groups inside of these countries. Yeah. And they're kind of saying, we don't want you here. We never agreed to these rules.
Yeah.
Kind of like Vietnam. I imagine that setting like bear traps and things is a war. I mean, is that a war crime? Like having spikes coming through the ground and stuff. I imagine they're not in the rules of war.
It's not a yes/no answer, to be honest. It's all about. I mean, I think.
So what lawyer?
Well, yeah, exactly. So what I'll say to start with is that that for me is why international humanitarian law is so important. Even talk human rights. So human rights, basically, in a very simplistic way, is what are the state limitations and responsibilities towards its population. So, for example, there is a prohibition on arbitrary deprivation of life. So the state can't just come in here and shoot you. Okay. If, for example, thankfully, if you took me hostage, you're threatening my life, there's a possibility in a limited way that you could lose your life at the hands of the state in a way which isn't in violation of human rights law. But human rights law really is about the regulation of how the state treats its people under its protection. And so then that question, well, what are the responsibilities of these armed groups? Well, under human rights law, there is, of course, discourse. People say, yes, they are bound by human rights law. But I'd say the majority, and I would say, well, it's not super clear-cut. On the other hand, international humanitarian law regulates all sides, states, non-state actors, whoever is fighting. But you made a good point to say, well, they didn't agree to these rules. I mean, the reality in which these laws were created was a kind of post-Second World War, and that's the criticism of the law. It's always a one war behind. So the Geneva Conventions, you could argue, which were created in 1949, would have been the perfect framework for regulating the Second World War.
Right.
And because that was state-to-state conflict. And in the Geneva Conventions, there's only one provision that regulates non-international armed conflict. But non-international armed conflict is the most common form of conflict today. Yeah. And you do have more post-Vietnam. You then got what we call Additional Protocol 2, which is a more detailed regulation of non-international armed conflict. But the downside of that, Israel, US, Russia, China have never signed up to that additional protocol. And then the challenge is, again, how do you get non-state armed groups to respect the law? But there is research and evidence suggests that they are motivated to do so for various reasons. There's an organisation that we work with called Geneva Call, who actually get armed groups to sign up to deeds of commitment. So even if formally they feel, okay, the Geneva Convention written by states, they're a kind of a tool against me. Oh no, I will sign up to these commitments to not engage in sexual violence, to not put down landmines, to not attack civilians.
Whose job's that? To walk into ISIS with a piece of paper and a pen and going, do you mind signing this for me, please? Because that's the job I don't want ever.
No, I have a lot of respect for this organisation. Geneva Call, they're one of our partner organisations, and a lot of it is relationship building. I won't speak for them, but yes, about relationship building, building trust with these groups. I think armed groups, we often have a bias that we assume armed groups is something like ISIS, so the bad guys, right? But globally, the typology and the difference in these armed groups, how they operate, their logic,
Wagner group
their approach.
like an armed group?
Yeah, that
essentially,
they could be a mercenary group.
But are they not?
Are
they not employed because they don't have to follow the laws of?
No, so you can't. So for example, if my country went to war against your country, I couldn't be like, right, a way to avoid me having to respect the law, I'll get my dog Nala to attack you, or attack the civilians because I know I can't. No, you can't. But is that I would be responsible.
Is that kind of what they do though? For example, we'll go to the Russia-Ukraine thing because I think obviously it's been going on for a while now. Depending on how deeply you've looked into it, not you, but how deeply people have looked into it, it potentially been going on for 10 years since 2016. Would you have said what Russia have done is a war crime by invading?
So that isn't a coherent proposition because but it could be. So under international criminal law, you have 4 categories of international crimes. War crimes, which is probably my area of specialty, is one, and that's violations of the laws of war. So once you're in a conflict, direct attacks against civilians, killing hostages, shooting wounded and sick people. There's a lot of war crimes, about 40 plus in the international.
Are they the main one? What would the main ones be?
Direct attacks against civilians.
So is that bombing a school, bombing a hospital, that sort of thing?
But it's all more complicated because any building can potentially be used for military purposes, including a school. Yeah,
because I think Israel was saying that there was Hamas bases under the hospitals.
Yeah,
but then so is that a war crime to hide in a? Do you know, like, it's almost like if I shoot at you and then you go to shoot back at me, but I pull Elle in front of me and she's a civilian.
Yeah.
Who's committing the war crime there? if you shoot and kill her, I've used a human shield. Is that a war crime?
So I don't want to be a lawyer, but I will be.
Okay. Yeah.
So the reason is, I start with for me the war crime is always this like a secondary question. Right. The first question is that a violation of the laws of war. So that would be the first question. So for you, using human shields, for me, that would be a violation. You haven't made appropriate distancing between yourself and the civilian. You're actually kind of using their protected status in order to engage in harm against me.
Yeah.
So for me, again, it's always a much more complicated analysis. You have to look at facts in detail versus the law. But let's say that case, and you say, that is a violation of the laws of war, and it's a serious violation, and therefore, rather than saying it is a war crime, as a lawyer, I would say that then should be investigated and prosecuted as a potential war crime.
And then you shooting the civilian is also a war. So at the end of
the question is that it's about the prohibition is on direct attacks against civilians. So the question is, am I directly attacking a civilian or you? And if you're a soldier, the law is complicated, but it's also there's some simple things. The whole international humanitarian law framework is based on the concept of distinction. So the idea is that in war, you should direct your harm towards the military, be it the military personnel, military objects, barracks, etc. And you can do that with quite a high degree of severity of violence towards other soldiers. There are some protections still even for soldiers and limitations on certain weapons. But the exchange is in the kind of, you're permitted to do that, but you then have to spare the civilians on the other side. So that's obviously nice in practice and historically quite easy to follow. You think of the kind of American wars and you've got the British in the nice big bright red coats fighting against the French in their big blue coats. Yeah. Probably fighting in a field in the middle of nowhere.
Historically,
and so
there
distinction,
would be a huge field, and these two armies would go and meet at this field.
But then how then do you follow the concept of distinction in a highly urban area where people are hiding, dressed as civilians, etc.? The law still applies, it's still relevant, but it's a much more complex factual analysis. So back to your question about Russia. So war crimes is one category of crime. Then you've got crimes against humanity, you've got genocide and aggression. And aggression is probably the newest international crime, and that's actually the international crime that you're speaking about, the going to engage in armed conflict. You could be guilty of the crime of aggression. So I know with Iraq, Tony Blair, who's often accused of being a war criminal, and I would a bit like, I I wouldn't defend him, but for him to be a war criminal, you would have to identify his direct control over British military, and that's not how the British military works.
Right.
But he could have been guilty for the crime of aggression. But at that time, the crime of aggression wasn't in the main international criminal body in the world, the International Criminal Court. It's something that's come in more recently.
But they were accusing Saddam Hussein of committing war crimes, and that's so you've often got this situation where I feel a lot of people, their initial thought is that one side is always held to a higher standard than the other. Obviously, you know, going back to conflicts like Vietnam, which, you know, America would probably get like aggression. That would probably be their kind of, well, obviously they use napalm as well, which is a war crime.
Yeah, use of
chemical weapons.
Incendiary weapons when directed against civilians are,
But they would then say that the Vietnamese who were protecting their own land were, you know, disguising themselves as civilians and things like that. So is America committing a war crime first, and then by the aggression by today's standards?
If you look historically, I don't think you'd have any difficulty establishing war crimes committed by all sides in the Vietnam War. I mean, also the same in World War II, like the carpet bombing of Dresden. If that happened today, that would be universally condemned as a war crime. In the UK, it's almost the idea that we committed war crimes against the Nazis is probably very triggering. People, how dare you?
Yeah.
But I mean, again, where we are today, the standards that we have today, if they were applied back then, they would have been clear war crimes.
Is there degrees though? You know, those 4 war crimes, is kind of like genocide the worst?
Yeah, so there's generally seen as like, and I don't know if you've seen recently that actually South Africa has made a petition to the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of, or at least violating aspects of the Genocide Convention. So genocide is often seen as the crime of crimes. People always forget about crimes against humanity. I think when you see like mass violence, mass atrocities, most of the time it'll be a crime against humanity. But most of the time put in kind of media, like, oh, genocide this, genocide that. Genocide is actually not a crime about numbers, it's a crime of intent. That you're not just killing someone because they don't like you, I'm killing you because I want to destroy your group in part or in totality, to kind of remove you from the earth. So to speak. So that's why the Holocaust would be an example of a genocide. You have one in Rwanda, the killing of the Tutsis by the Hutu is another example. So there was that specific intent, not just to kill people, but I want to destroy
your
them.
bloodline's gone,
or,
you'll never come back.
Create environment and circumstances. So some of the crimes under genocide include creating certain conditions affecting ability to procreate and lots of things. So often it's a very... emotive crime, but it is seen as the crime of crimes because, again, it's that intent to destroy a group in whole and in part. But often people forget about crimes against humanity, which is, I would say, it's a good example of a crime against humanity for me would be the 9/11 mass civilian casualties attacked in that case. So
there's no military advantage to.
And this is why there are some differences. So war crimes can only happen in an armed conflict, but genocide, crimes against humanity, they could happen both in peacetime, but also in conflict as well.
There's allegations against China potentially trying to commit a genocide.
Against the Uyghur,
not covered as much, doesn't have as much kind of support for it. No. Is that because, have you ever been commissioned to go and have a look at? I feel like obviously everybody knows that China's a particularly difficult place to get information from. Is there certain countries where things like that can happen and it's very difficult to actually go in and see if there are war crimes being committed or even crimes against humanity?
To work on the area of work that I work on is pretty sensitive because, for example, when I went to Pakistan, I was told by my professor in Geneva, you will get kicked out. You won't even be let in because you'll work on international humanitarian law. And for many people, governments, they're like, oh, he's a war crimes investigator. Yeah. So don't want to.
Yeah, no one wants a war crimes investigator turning up at their door.
Well, if you're worried about, don't commit war crimes. If you're worried about that.
But nobody who's committing war crimes wants a war crimes lawyer.
Because, and actually even the global guardian of international humanitarian law. It's called the International Committee of the Red Cross. They have a specific defined role in the conventions to say that they kind of have to protect the law. It's very hard for them because they also have to do things like negotiate hostage release, like they did in Gaza. So on one hand, you're doing very sensitive hostage negotiations, then obviously publicly you can't come out and condemn Hamas Israel for committing violations because you're trying to build their trust in order to. So anyway, so there's a big challenge there. But so, for example, in Pakistan, because I was with a university, an American university, that's fine. And so I engaged there. We did a lot of kind of workshops with students and media. We talked about international humanitarian law, but we didn't talk about Pakistan. We talked about Syria. We talked about Israel-Palestine, Yemen, Mali. And of course, there was like, so in Syria, this would be prohibited. And that's something that's happening in Pakistan as well.
So you have to go in there. Are you collecting intel when you're there? Or are you...
No.
So you're just in
that's
there
what they think. Again,
facts.
you often think that people think you're a spy.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, a lot of our work is really about like education. It's like explaining to people what the laws of war say, what they don't say. And you would hope that through your work, you could work with civil society or like a charity, and they are then able to put pressure on the government to respect the law. I'll give you one example of how our work actually can do good. So I have a team in Mali, and they will not publicly come out and say if there's a violation of the laws of war. It's not appropriate in that context. We would get kicked out. But sometimes that's okay because there are still opportunities, and so we have engaged with, at times, not so recently, with the Malian army, but also with magistrates and judges in Mali, and inform them about the legal framework around international law, like what they can and can't do when it comes to detention of civilians.
Do you think some of them aren't necessarily aware of it, so it's potentially an education problem with a lot of them?
A lot of it is about awareness. Sometimes it's not at all. They know the law very well. But in this case, it's always difficult to say because of our great training they then did this. But we analysed that thanks to our engagement, technical support to these judges in Mali, 4 months later, not hundreds, but tens of civilians were released from detention. And so for us, the fact that, let's say it's 20, 25 people were released from detention because the judges were more informed about what international law does and doesn't say, is a really great thing. That's 25 people that return to their families, can live their lives, etc. So, but each context that we work in, you have to take different tactics. Like how you engage in Mali, how me and my team we engage in Israel and Gaza is very different. We can be quite public and quite vocal. We can't be so public and vocal maybe in Syria or in Lebanon for different reasons. And it's not that we're being critical of Israel or Hamas. It's just the environment allows for different opportunities.
Just because
it's a bit sensitive, because you can imagine no one wants to... a lot of states like Pakistan, they don't want to accept they're even in a situation of armed conflict, because that for them is we've lost control.
Right.
So that's why in Pakistan, even in working on IHL...
I don't even really know what's going on in Pakistan.
They just don't want the world to know there's any problems. You've got Taliban-affiliated forces. Now it's probably... The question of is there still a conflict today, but there's certain elements of conflict, but they don't want to accept, and that's why for some working on international humanitarian law is so sensitive, because politically you don't have control of your country. And even if you do acknowledge you're in a situation of conflict, you then don't want to deal with potential accountability in terms of war crimes and stuff like that. So it is a sensitive area. So we have to be careful. It's not so easy.
Is it difficult? I know it's very easy to retrospectively look at things and go, that was a war crime, that was a crime against humanity. Sometimes do you feel like it can be quite difficult within the kind of war setting? Obviously, it's life or death situations. There's certain things that you can totally understand. Like if you just decide to kill all of your hostages, then that was just a conscious decision. Is there some things where it's very difficult because, it's a very high pressure situation. It's potentially, you're probably not that bothered about committing a war crime if the alternative is that you die. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that is necessarily always not going to always be the case, but if you're in a life or death situation and you commit a war crime to escape that,
Yeah, I can't think of a factual situation whereby that would be a war crime.
Okay, because
the law itself is designed for conflict. It's not this aspirational, you have to never kill someone. If your life isn't threatened, you can engage in lethal force.
Yeah.
But no, you're right, that armed conflict is the most difficult and challenging information environment.
Yeah.
So again, you'll ask me, right, okay, is this a war crime, yes or no? I can tell you at length what the law says. But if I don't have the facts, I need to bring those two things together.
Yeah.
And also, like you can allude to, there are 40, 50 different war crimes and they have different components. So, for example, I'll take the Israel-Gaza situation. It's fairly straightforward. They filmed themselves engaging in direct attacks against civilians. So certain aspects of that, just from an information perspective, was fairly straightforward. Of course, from an actual perspective, Hamas targeting, say, Israeli military wouldn't be a war crime. That, say, is in line with the laws of war. But of course, others would label that terrorism. But from the laws of war perspective, it's not. So that was, I would say, in my team, we've released a report, if anyone wants to read it, detailed of the Hamas attacks and explaining, what violations of the laws of war and what potential war crimes we identified. Then when it comes to the kind of Israeli response to that, we had to separate the imposition of the siege, so the denial of electricity, fuel, water into Gaza, from the conduct of Israel's attacks. Now, some people would say, and on our report, people might read as a tonal difference between how we talk about Hamas attacks and how we talk about Israel's conduct. It's simply because the factual information we have to make clear assessments is different in that case. And the law itself, when it comes to targeting, we don't have access to Israel's military. We don't know what their decisions are. However, we've still made analysis that we think they are engaging in pretty much direct contradiction of the laws of war. But it's a very nuanced analysis, and that's clear. However, the imposition of the siege is really straightforward. That's a clear violation of international humanitarian law and clearly should be investigated as a war crime, because if you accepted that type of conduct, the idea that you can surround a population of 2 million people, you can cut off water, fuel, electricity for a sustained period and that'd be okay because there's some bad guys in that group. The idea that there are any restrictions in war is almost gone out the window. We're now 90 days into the conflict. And I mean, again, I'm not an expert on nutrition, but...
So is that a war crime?
In my view, the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction and is investigating. And I think the most likely case that we made against Israeli officials is the use of starvation as a method of warfare.
Yeah.
So,
is that a war crime?
That is a war crime,
yeah. Because that used to be kind of one of the... when you look back historically through battles, one of the things was cutting supply lines. Is a big, attacking supply lines has always been, it's something that they did in the Second World War, famously attacking supply lines to stop something Russia are doing to Ukraine, or were doing to Ukraine, stopping aid. So that is a war crime.
But yeah, exactly. So using starvation as a method of warfare. There, of course, are particular components, intentionality. Are they directing it towards the civilian population or the military? But again, you get back to that fundamental principle of distinction. If you don't make any distinction between the civilians and the fighters, simply cutting off food, water, the ability to survive.
All 2 million of them aren't on militia, and
exactly.
That the children
so
on.
It's a pretty easy analysis, and I would challenge you to find a serious lawyer that would justify the imposition of the siege as being in conformity with international law. Israel
say, as their party line, that they're giving civilians a chance to leave. So they're saying, leave because we're about to attack this place because we think we think there's a militia in there who are an aggressor. Yeah. So obviously then it comes into question whether they are giving them ample ability to leave or not. Just from what I see on kind of, because you see from both sides, don't you, when you see things come in from the media. So it's obviously extremely, extremely difficult. Could you say that other things that you've seen there will be Israeli war? Do you feel like there is Israeli war crimes then?
There are, in my view, clear violations of international humanitarian law, and I would expect. Again, it's so even myself, I'm exposed, of course, to social media. Just yesterday, I saw a video of, and the narrative was that this guy and his child had been waved through by the Israelis. Okay? You can pass. And then they were taken down. Based on that clip, if that factual information is correct, that would be clearly a war crime. This guy was with his child, was clearly not a militant actor, was a civilian, direct attack against a civilian. But that would need to be subject to a robust investigation. If you think about a domestic murder, we could witness something out of our window now. We could tell someone's been killed and murdered. But that would be our opinion. You'd need then a whole mechanism of the police, the judicial response, and that would take months, potentially a year before that person, maybe we find out it's not murder, it was manslaughter. I don't know. Whatever it may be. So I increasingly, I do find it very difficult to separate my legal from my kind of humanity head. But based on the information we've seen testimony of Israeli soldiers saying openly they shot 2 kids and they shot them in the head. Again, this needs to be verified, don't get me wrong. I'm a lawyer, I'd have to verify, particularly got to be careful of fake information.
Misinformation.
And so you have to go through a rigorous analysis. But again, if you look at the statements that's been made by high-level officials in Israel, from the Prime Minister down, the idea there were no innocent people, and at the moment, what we don't have is a lot of facts. There's very little information coming out of Gaza. I believe that over the next 6 months to 12 months, when we actually understand what has gone on and is going on in Gaza, is the idea that there aren't international crimes, I would be staggered.
What then could you expect to see as the repercussions for this? Because obviously, it's very hard to pin down militias like Hamas. It's very hard to actually... Israel's there for everybody to see. It's a state. There are people in charge. You'd think that if it comes out later that there are war crimes and they're at the wrong, then there's going to be people to prosecute. Is that something that we can probably expect to see? Actual officials being prosecuted?
Yeah,
I
would expect both Hamas leaders and Israeli leaders to be subject to arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court at some point in the future. Maybe that's naive. I don't know that for sure. But I can't see a scenario where it's only one side of the conflict.
But who actually carries that out?
The International Criminal Court.
And who are the kind of people who go in and arrest those people?
So that's the...
Because it has to be backed by someone who's scarier than Israel or Hamas.
So that's the big challenge of So the International Criminal Court is an amazing construct. The idea that we have a global criminal court is a huge success, but it only really occurred because it came after Rwanda and Yugoslavia. They had these ad hoc tribunals, and the international community said that's not an efficient way of responding to international crimes. We need a permanent international criminal court. And so it's been developing over the last 15, 20 years. The majority of cases have affected African states. But the African states themselves have referred situations to the court. So people say the court's anti-African because it's done only African cases. But a lot of African states referred...
How many of those 50 conflicts take place in Africa?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Is it a good percentage of them?
Yeah, probably. Off the top of my head, you got a conflict in Mozambique. Yeah. I was there earlier last year. I was in Nigeria. You've got South Sudan, DRC... Ethiopia, again, just off the top of my head, but it's...
Just there's a lot of countries there, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of countries in Africa, and there's, there's a lot of militias that you kind of hear of and stuff.
Yeah, but even the International Criminal Court, it can't police a war crime in any situation. It has to have what we call jurisdiction. So the UK, for example, has signed up to the Rome Statute. The US, Israel, has not. So in theory... a UK soldier committing a war crime could be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court, in theory. There's this concept of complementarity, which means that the court has to establish that the national authorities have failed to investigate. So there was some quite a lot of coverage about potential war crimes in Afghanistan by British military, and the ICC was investigating but hasn't moved forward with cases for various reasons. So there's jurisdiction there at least. Now, whether things happen or not, is a question of the available facts. Is the case strong? Whatever it may be. But then when it comes to, therefore, the US conduct, the International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction. The only way that you would have jurisdiction over the US, say US forces committing war crimes, would be if that was committed in a country that was signed up to the court. So there's a complicated assessment.
Yeah, so it's difficult because obviously, you know, everybody sees America and, you know, it's no secret that they have this military power that if America say, you know, everyone knows about Guantanamo Bay, nobody knows what went on there and things like that, you know. I don't really know much about war crimes. If I had to guess, I'd say that probably some things that happened there would class as war crimes.
There's been clearly documented war crimes in the case of Guantanamo.
So, but then who holds countries like, you know, it's very easy to go, Hamas are terrible, you know, Russia's always the bad guy, Russia are terrible. You know, before the Ukraine war, all I heard about Ukraine was that it was the hub of neo-Nazism in Europe, and that it was a terribly corrupt country. And then obviously the Russian thing happened, and now they're the good guys. I feel like it's always kind of directed in one direction, and it's never, you know, people will say stuff about, you know, America, Britain, countries like that, but is it going to be very difficult to go in and say, you know, to some of these superpowers like America, that's very, you know, you guys have committed a war crime. Let's, you know, is that, you know, it's easy to say, oh, you know, Israel, let's lock them up. Hamas, let's lock them up. What about if it's America committing?
Well, I would actually argue that Israel is also a superpower. So, I mean, what's happening in Gaza today, for me, it is showing that if you're angry enough, you're powerful enough, the rules don't apply to you. That's at least my assessment. So the idea is that horrific Hamas attacks, therefore gloves are off. And the UK statements of UK, both Conservative and Labour, US, is also being like, well, they're part of our team. Yeah. So therefore, all the statements that were against Russia, which as a lawyer I'm like, yes, correct. Attacking a hospital is a violation of the laws of war. Starving the population is a violation. And all of a sudden, that same factual patterns we're seeing in relation to a context involving an ally rather than a foe, the political statements are very different. So, of course, that makes... I mean, I was in Mozambique in September, and there's a conflict there, and we're working with the humanitarian community. And often when we're doing these trainings, we explain the law and why it's relevant. Yeah. I can imagine if I went there again next month, one of the major questions I said, well, this international humanitarian law, all very well and good, but it just doesn't matter. Look what's happening in Gaza. And I think that's a fair critique because, again, if I was looking at it, a lot of people would say, I mean, again, Israel-Palestine is so politicized. If people want to argue with my opinion, do it. Talk on the law. Don't talk on the politics, just on the law. But I would say that if you were to accept that Israel's conduct in Gaza is in line with international law is meaningless as a relevant tool of protecting human dignity in conflict. Because it means you could starve a population. 80% of the population, I think, according to the World Food Programme, is at risk of starvation over the next 12 months. If not, a third is already in a classification of starvation. The level of the pictures of northern Gaza, again, if you compare that to the pictures that we saw coming out of Aleppo and other places in Syria, which were horrific, the level of destruction in Gaza, it's been raised. Now, I'm sure people say, well, Hamas has got tunnels, but again, the law is meant to limit what armies can do, and there doesn't really seem to be much limit to what Israel's doing.
Does Israel have boots on the ground, though?
It does now, yeah.
Because that would be, you know, when there's not a lot of, you know, as a British person that you can kind of relate to when it comes to stuff like this. But obviously, there was, you know, a so-called terrorist organisation in the IRA in Ireland for a long time. There were terrorist attacks in England.
That was an armed conflict.
But we didn't flatten Ireland. No,
exactly. I mean, that's what I would... I mean, it is always difficult for me, I think. As lawyers, we're really bad at communicating to the public. Like, particularly Israel-Palestine. I've worked in Gaza. I've lived there. I've spent 4 years. So everyone's like, oh, well, he's biased, right?
You've lived in Israel?
Yeah.
What was that like?
I lived in Jerusalem for a year, Ramallah in the West Bank for 2 years with work trips to Gaza. It was I mean, in my opinion, Israel it's a pretty right-wing society. I would go to a bar in the Galilee in the north of Israel, and they would talk about Palestinians as being mosquitoes.
Which, you've got to feel the irony in the fact, the state of Israel become, after the Second World War, at the hands of fascism, a right-wing organization. Yeah. And the Nazis probably referred to Jewish people in the same sort of manner. So you kind of got to think, there's always two things, isn't there? If something bad happens to someone, they either want to make bad things happen to other people, or they want to never let bad things happen to other people because they know what it feels like. Yeah. And it feels like this Israel situation is the former of that. It's kind of like, well, sorry.
For me, it's working that. I would say that I had to leave after 3.5 years because I felt the whole thing just like, I would say tragic was my emotion, because I was there, like you said, and I was there with my Geneva Conventions, and these were like the products, the global one of the global responses, of course, to what happened in the Second World War. And then me invoking that law and being called anti-Semitic, I think I was called Ahmadinejad when I was in Hebron once, because I was with a delegation of members of parliament from Sweden, and we were showing them around, just seeing the reality. I was like, but this is Geneva Conventions. This was but again, I think the whole situation with Israel, and I think anyone really want to inform themselves, there is this narrative, and with my Israeli friends, they say this is when you grow up, the whole concept was that we're going to create, there is a land without people that's going to be given to a people without land. But that is a fallacy. Yes, the whole point of the international community creating a kind of a home for the Jewish people, I think, was that makes sense. I understand that.
Yeah, I don't think
but there were people there.
Yeah.
And they were, and again, you can look through the UN records of 500,000 to 750,000 people were displaced. You've had, Gaza is a refugee population. These are basic facts. So again, people, it's such an emotive context. And I'd always say, okay, well, would you agree that Gaza is a refugee population? Why do people in Gaza want to destroy Israel? Why does a political terrorist actor like Hamas, why do they thrive? You've got to at least have some awareness of history to at least understand what are the dynamics there in play. And the refugee camps in Gaza, there are refugee camps in Jerusalem today, still, from 1948, from the 1967 war. You have Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, in Syria, with no right to return. Palestinians still have keys to their homes in Israel now. So, and again, people say, well, this could be, you're justifying what Hamas did. No, it is relevant historical information to inform yourself of what's happening. And it is a situation of oppression, of people living under occupation for a certain amount of time. As an IHL lawyer, and also not myself, but others, I look at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, violations of international humanitarian law committed by Israel didn't start in their response to October 7th. That's been for the last 20 plus years. They've been documented. The UN commissions of inquiry have identified the development of settlements of Israel in the West Bank, the destruction of property. I've investigated killings of children in the West Bank, but again, these things don't get the headlines. And there's been no accountability. And that's why for me, after 3.5 years, I had to leave, because I had this framework. And IHL is a limited legal framework, but the one area where it's quite protective is occupation situations, because in the Second World War, the civilian population was seen at most at risk when they were living under occupation, German occupation of Poland, for example, and of course all the death camps, etc. So as a result, the Geneva Conventions are super strict when it comes to how occupying powers treat civilians. Then you look at, it's not the only occupation in the world, but one of the major occupations in the world, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. If people say, well, it's not occupied, it's disputed. Well, even according to the Israeli forces, it's occupied territory. Even according to the Israeli courts, it's occupied territory. According to the International Court of Justice, not a particularly progressive body, it's occupied territory. And So therefore, one thing is, and then there's been a violation of those basic rights over the last period. I think people need to listen to what the Israeli officials say. Sometimes, even in the UK, I saw, even yesterday, so David Lammy, who's the shadow foreign secretary, said that Israeli ministers must support a two-state solution. Okay? Israeli ministers do not support a two-state solution and haven't for a significant period of time. So the question is, so the West were a bit naive in saying, Israel, they've got to be the good guy. Yes, maybe they're doing a few things wrong, but they're the good guys, or they're our ally, and they just need to recommit to the two-state solution. But what they've done over the last period is, since the Oslo agreements in the early 90s, I think there's about 200,000 Israelis living in the West Bank, and the whole point of the law is to kind of prevent population movement. They kind of want to keep things as they are until the occupation is over. We're now having there's around 750,000 Israelis living in occupied territory, and the idea that they're simply going to leave, and this is the West Bank, we're not even talking about Gaza, is... So the question I would always ask, what does it mean to be... what is Israel's goal? What's its end goal? What does it mean to be a democratic Jewish state if significant parts of that population are not Jewish or Christian or Muslim or non-religious? But don't get me. It's...
I think the reason that I always ask you whenever I see anything, and I always message you on Instagram just to ask if this is... It's very difficult to get the good thing. The advantage that you have is that you clearly look at things situation by situation. So like the Hamas attack in isolation, what Israel did in terms of cutting off the supply in isolation, the other thing in isolation, because like you said, from a legal perspective, you have to break everything down in their case by case, and they have to be looked at objectively, and they have to be looked at, for those individual scenarios. And that's what other people can't do, because they're not having to, from a legal perspective, they're looking at everything as one whole. And I think that's why it's so difficult for people to, one, get their head around, two, be anything other than a humanitarian and just think, well, this is terrible, what they're doing is terrible, because, people would potentially say about Israel, Hamas did a terrible attack, gloves are off. 9/11 happened, the gloves are off. Do you know what I mean? Like you fly a plane into a New York City center. Yeah. There are boots on the ground, and we're coming, and it's kind of like looking at those things all in isolation, which I think is the law is. Sorry, the law is, and I say this when people ask me about the situation in Gaza. For me, it's a humanitarian, legal and political crisis. I can talk to you about the legal aspects of the crisis. I can speak a little bit to the humanitarian aspects, but it's ultimately a political crisis. So even looking at the Israel-Gaza situation through the lens of international is an incredibly limited way. I would implore most people to start with the humanitarian situation. And that, of course, includes people affected by and directly harmed by the Hamas attacks, and also then all those affected by the Israeli response to that. That, for me, is... and that's why, the law is limited, but then it needs to be somewhat relevant. That's the whole point of having this legal framework, is to allow you to navigate these highly polarized contexts. A lot of people have opinions on Israel, Palestine. Many of them aren't coming from an informed place, and I would implore people to do reading. Look at the UN data, look at the UN website, look at a map, look at a UN map of the occupied West Bank, the level of control, separation. It's a situation of systematic oppression. I don't think that's a controversial statement to make. But of course, the defense, the response to that is always, Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, or there's terrorism, so we have to respond to that. And I always come back to the point again, is that, and again, I think human rights lawyers, we do a really bad job in communicating, because the law is seen, particularly human rights. Whenever I hear human rights, it's always like
this human rights law has helped this person, his right to family life. He has a cat, has allowed him to not be deported, whatever. Human rights law is a compromise. It is not aspirational. Human rights law is always built into it. How can we protect the collective versus the individual? So it's a very limited way. And it's the same when it comes to, even more so, when it comes to war and violence. Okay, how can we allow a military actor to function and win their conflict, but at least have some protection for people and civilians? So these are really basic standards. And we're living in a world there when it's like too often, well, actually, they shouldn't apply. Like you said, the gloves should come off. But it's like, okay, if we accept that, it then just means that there are no limitations in what we do. There's no limitation on violence. Like you said, the problem is war. Conflict is horrible. Even for me, I've been in rooms with people and they've asked me, is this a violation of the law of war, like an attack on a school? And based on the certain factual patterns, I have in the past said no. Do I feel good about that? No. But the question is a legal question. Do I think it was right? My answer would be different. Do you think that's a good thing that's happened? Of course, I'm not going to say, yeah, brilliant, the school's been. But the law is nuanced, it's complicated, and the problem is the war. It's not the law. But now we're in a situation, and I'm deeply concerned that, so when the Ukraine war kicked off, or the Russian invasion into Ukraine, all of a sudden there's a lot of interest in the laws of war. And I've never had so many media requests in my life, the BBC, others, tell us about the laws of war, what do they say? And I was like, okay, it's a bit frustrating that I've had no calls on Yemen, on Syria, but it doesn't matter.
Those conflicts definitely get. I mean, we had a guest who was from Yemen, and you know that leads to other atrocities, as we found out, that aren't just that go beyond like the actual effects the war have on the population, poverty, things like that. But it must be frustrating then that some of these wars, some of these conflicts, they're not asked about. Yeah. And then some of them, and it always seems to be when there's an incentive to the other side committing a war. It's almost like, oh, please tell us that what Russia's doing is bad. And that must be kind of like, does that in any way, do you think that might in any way influence people's response to it? People's, the way that people, decide what they'll interpret those laws
exactly
based on the pressures on them actually being a war crime.
Right. Because that's the I think particularly the difference in the response to Israel, Gaza versus Ukraine, Russia by the West. I'm talking particularly UK, US. The law then just becomes a political tool. If you're a dictator somewhere in the world, the narrative that I've heard many times over the last couple of decades, international law is not international law, it's just a political tool of the West. No, it's not. It's the law applies to everyone, regardless, every situation, circumstance. And then when you have, I think in this moment, there's a huge crisis within my kind of professional community and peers that we're fundamentally committed to the idea that all contexts, there should be law that protects human rights, basic human dignity. It's one tool to help cut through the political narrative, or should. But now it's become so politicized. Like I said, we get asked the question, has Russia committed international humanitarian? Yes, it has. But then there's no question if it's, like I said, if you're big enough, you're powerful enough, you're an ally of the West. Yeah. And it's really hard. And again, I think, even me personally, there are quite, do I want to work? This is such a, I've of course been following the situation in Israel and Gaza. I've seen quite graphic images of the Hamas attacks and of course of the Israeli response.
Like through your job?
Yeah.
So you got access to things that people wouldn't have seen via just media? Yeah,
we do have it, but that's also my team on the ground also have access to that. But it's...
So do you feel like you see way more than... Do you feel like you can make a way more informed decision because you can just see so many more of the facts? Is there information that's not available to the public that you can get access to?
I think the information is... at the moment, there is... what is of a deep concern, there's no real international media presence in Gaza. And that's why for me, I think, of course, I'm saying through my work, even just through social media available. You're seeing a little snapshots. Like I gave the example from yesterday of this potential kind of direct attack against a civilian. I've seen, there's little snapshots, but I think the full picture is not there. And that media play a huge role, but no international media is allowed into Gaza right now.
That's always a good sign, isn't it? When you ban the media.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
nobody who's ever been up to no good.
And that's
has ever banned the
what
media.
anyone that wants. I mean, anyone wants to defend Israel's response, please do so. Yeah. But then I would say, okay, well, will you respect the decision of the International Criminal Court when they take war crimes cases? Will you respect the decision of the International Court of Justice looking at the question of genocide? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, in the immediate event, if ever you hear a lawyer saying an actor has not violated the law, they are not a credible lawyer. You can never say that, because every state actor, every non-state actor is very capable of violating the law. There's no actor in the world that can't violate the law. You can say it's unlikely based on information I don't think they have. I'm not saying no, they haven't violated the law. That is a very problematic statement to make, and it's rather actually no, there's no evidence to suggest that they have. On the other hand, no, we have information to suggest they have violated the law. But yeah, it's just it's a deeply depressing, I would say personally, moment where this framework, which I think is still very important, it's old. Like I said, it's Geneva Conventions of 1949. It's this law is quite old, but its concepts are: don't directly attack civilians, don't commit sexual violence, don't torture people, don't attack hospitals. These are pretty good concepts. Yeah. But yet, right now we're seeing strong indications that these aren't being respected. And again, we of course get criticised from both sides. One hand, you're saying too much. Other people say you're not saying enough. But we have to only, like I said, we have often quite limited factual information available to us at this moment, be it the UK, US, Israel. They want to control the narrative around this. At a certain point, the facts will speak for themselves.
Has there ever been a UK, US sort of leader condemned for a war crime and have consequences of it? Because obviously, you can look at the likes of, Saddam Hussein, accused of war crime, convicted of war crimes, crimes against humanity. Colonel Gaddafi, the same sort of thing, war crimes, crimes against humanity. We both know
Putin.
Yeah, but I mean, I doubt Putin's going to get hung because, do you know what I mean? Whereas, I mean, Saddam Hussein was hung and Gaddafi was, did they get killed by the people or something? Gaddafi?
Yeah,
was he executed?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I think they just. So you've got these kind of the repercussions are there, very, for these smaller states that are less powerful, but that's never gonna. Is there ever going to be kind of, if America commit a war crime, if America get, found to have committed a war crime, actually charged with one, is there ever going to be any repercussions? Is that not
America would say that its own internal system of, be it military justice or investigation through criminal modes would be the response. I don't think there'll never be a international mechanism that will be able to do so.
America will give themselves a little slap on the wrist.
Even actually, I think there was when the International Criminal Court was about. There were discussions with Bush about the Bomb the Hague Act. So the Hague is where the court is based in the Netherlands. So the idea that if they ever took an American was held to account there. But no, I mean this is the question. So is selective justice better than no justice? Or that's of course a constant question we have in our sector. So should we, let's say, fight for Putin and others to be held to account, to be arrested, to be tried, or other senior officials who have committed serious crimes held to account, be it in Uganda, Syria, Yemen? Yeah, something's better than nothing. But then, of course, the other side is, well, what about those crimes or offences committed by more powerful actors?
Yeah, because you've got to be, if you're, in charge of Israel, you've got to be thinking to yourself, if you start trying to accuse, if you're my ally and you start trying to accuse me of war crimes, first of all, what are we doing here? I'm going to take the blame for war crimes when, we're friends and there's no way that you're ever going to take, responsibility for anything that you guys do. So I'm not just going to, you're not leaving me out hanging me out to dry. The deal is that none of us admit to ever doing anything, or you can't just kind of come in and accuse me. We've got a mutual agreement here that, we can accuse these other guys of doing stuff, but it's never going to be, if Israel and obviously Israel and America are allies, if you're the leader of Israel, you've got to be pissed off if there's stuff like that comes in, because you've got to be looking at America going,
the US, you're probably right, but even the US have indicated some concerns, which is, I think,
good for them
publicly. Yeah. You have to think, and this is why. So I'm sure, and I will be, and have been. Who's this anti-Israeli guy? Blah blah blah, because he's saying Israel's violated. Well, okay, you also asked me on Ukraine, and you didn't say I was anti-Russian. Anyway, but the very fact that the US government has indicated some concerns with regard to Israel's conduct, that speaks for me volumes. What do they think privately? So again, but of course, I actually do think that the US in particular has a significant amount of leverage over Israel. I think Israel, because of a lack of accountability in its treatment of Palestinian people over the last decades, if you look at the discourse, they're like, even the ministers saying, who does the US think they are? Because they're a bit untouchable, really. And they've kind of, even if the US thinks it's the big brother, Israel might just say, no, what are you going to do? And a lot of statements have been coming out this last few days criticising the statement of the Israeli Interior Minister that's talking about the forced transfer of the population of Gaza into other states. This would be such a classic example of a war crime, and actually a crime against humanity as well, by displacing the entire population. So basically saying, look guys,
if you don't want to be here, see you.
Yeah, they're going to... a lot of people would actually believe that the whole movement of the population from the north to the south, this is one of the most densely populated parts of the world, 2 million people, there's pushing them out into the Sinai. And initially, that idea would have been dismissed, but now it's actually been vocalized by Israeli ministers as that's what they want to do. And of course, there's been, like I said, I think, I don't know if the UK government, but at least the Labour have come out and said this is not acceptable. But again, a naivety in their statement saying, Israel ministers commit to a two-state solution. Well, they're talking about ethnically cleansing people. I don't think they're really going to talk about two-state solution. It comes across very naive. You've got Japan, France, a lot of other states have come out publicly. But if that's all the consequences going to be, is like statements of being kind of a bit of slap wrists, I'm deeply concerned that Israel will, over the period, there will be significant displacement of the Gazan population, and they will not be allowed to return. And people are, well, how can you possibly say that?
They're edging them out, aren't they?
They're an existing refugee population from Israel. They're in Gaza. They're going to be pushed out again. And this is also why, when you said, well, Israel's warned people to move from the north. If I was a 80-year-old person in Gaza, I've been in refugee camp in Gaza for 60 years, and Israel tells me to move, I'd be like, I'm okay. I'm going to stay where I am. This is my home. This is my family. I'd rather die here. And so, again, that's another important thing as a lawyer. Simply because an area is a no-go zone, you can't go here. And again, I've seen this in Myanmar. I've seen this in South Sudan. You can't say, right, you guys can't go outside. If you do, I'll shoot you.
Yeah, that's not treating people.
I'm still a civilian. The question is, if you're a militant or an armed actor, yeah, that would be in line with the laws of war. But simply you or me going into an area that we're not allowed to go to doesn't mean that we lose our right as civilians. And that's the type of cases that I have looked at in the West Bank, when you had children going in to collect tea leaves to make tea, but they were in an area that the Israelis said you're not allowed, and they were shot in the limbs. This is documented. This is not me coming up with stories. These are things that I've investigated directly. So again, and we're seeing that in Gaza, that there's this narrative, and also the hospital. I don't know if the Al-Shifa, the idea that this was a command and control center.
Where they thought Hamas was. They thought Hamas were in the hospital.
But actually, what the New York Times did a detailed investigation, and at the time of the attack, that wasn't the case. The evidence suggests that Hamas vacated the premises 2 or 3 days earlier. Now, some people have said, see, Hamas was using it, therefore what Israel did was fine. But from a legal perspective, a hospital can only use protection from attack for and such time it is being used for military purposes. only after a warning is given. Demands are made on that actor to stop. It's a very set criteria, and there's been a lot of reductionist, because Hamas was using it, or there's a Hamas person in the area, that's the end of the legal conversation. No, there's a lot more criteria in play, and that's why, again, we've done detailed analysis to go step by step. And again, people can support Israel, but you can support Israel, but you can't, for me, unless you know what the law says, say what they're doing is lawful. I think you have to separate those two things.
So I think one of the most fascinating things that when we first spoke was all the different places that you've been to. Where would you have said the kind of the most, craziest experiences have been places you've been? Because I don't know anybody else who's been to Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that every place I've been to, and be it Gaza, Islamabad, Bamako, your expectations and reality are always different. You can think a place will be a certain place. And for me, I don't think there's been any place I've been to where I've really felt, I wouldn't say in danger, but just people are people. Like, people are super friendly. Of course, when you first arrive at Bamako airport, you've never been there, you don't know how to get your luggage. There's a sea of people all trying to grab you, but then my colleague is... Anyway, so I would say that my main memories have always been a positive one. I think sometimes, of course, I'm very aware I'm this white guy turning up, trying to tell people respect the law, but I've been very privileged to meet some amazing, inspiring people who are certainly, I think, more dedicated, more committed to kind of human rights than I could ever be. And sometimes I don't really understand how they can kind of keep that motivation. I would say one of my kind of most powerful experiences, one of my first, was when I was, I think I mentioned before, 22, 23 years old, and I'd finished my law degree. I wanted to work in human rights, but I felt I needed to get a better understanding of what that really means, and I got an opportunity to work in Cambodia, and I was sat down in a room with a kind of anti-trafficking charity, and there were 3 little girls, 6 years old, and looking back, I'm not quite sure how ethical it was that I was sat down with these girls, with the director of the centre, but she was explaining their situation. They'd been trafficked by their own family. They'd been subjected to the most horrific form of sexual violence, leaving them with long-term health implications. And it just struck me that, one, I still struggle, and maybe why I can kind of, at least for now, do my job, is I don't fully comprehend. I think if you did, you wouldn't be able to do your job about kind of violence and atrocities and things. And I've been always able to, because I can't fully comprehend it, because I've come from a very fortunate background, not been subject to violence in my life, and I always go to, okay, but what can we do to help? Okay, what can we do? What structure's in place? How can we... You listen to the people, the experts, and other people on the ground who are Cambodian human rights defenders that are doing amazing work, and how can we support your work, etc. So that's incredibly motivating. But yeah, going to Gaza and having the most amazing seafood. Like, who'd have thought that? That is what I mean about, I think, our expectations of what places are really like.
It always, whenever I see like kind of acts of humanity coming out of places that you think are the most desperate and are having the worst time, and yet you see those kind of small acts of kindness or like people's commitment to things that you probably wouldn't be thinking of if you were in a war-torn country, but obviously it's become their reality, and yet they still have a requirement to fulfill their own human needs and fulfill the needs of the people around them. I always feel like when life and joy can exist in such drastic places, it really puts things into perspective. I think I've always enjoyed speaking to you because the more you learn about things and the kind of, it's always good to speak to you because you come from an angle that most people aren't going to get to speak to someone who's going to come from this sort of angle that you come from, because being a professional in those environments, you've got talking heads online, but whether or not Ben Shapiro's actually been into Gaza is to be questioned. And, you get talking heads on both sides. Both of them probably haven't seen the conflict. They're working on second, third, fourth, or maybe fifth-hand information. but I do think that it's very, very important to listen to both sides, because quite often it's somewhere in the middle. And one of the things that I always would always enjoy was listening to this objective viewpoint on it, because I've always found that useful. But then listening to, as much of an objective opinion from both sides of things as possible, which I'm sure you get the opportunity to do, which informs your decisions and makes these conversations really really useful. I think I could probably sit here and listen to you talk for absolutely hours on this, but thank you so much for coming on. I think that people getting to listen to this side of things is incredibly useful as well, because if there are going to be changes, quite often they do come from pressures from populations.
No pleasure. One last thought. I'd always encourage people just try to put themselves in other people's shoes, and I think it was quite easy, and at least I noted when Ukraine happened, people could say, "Oh my God, Russia's invading." I can really understand that, and the general atmosphere, I would say, in this, from what I picked up, was that quite a lot of openness to refugees, quite openness to people. But then, okay, good. That's a good thing. Nobody should be criticised for that reaction. And even in the town I live in, Scotland, people were opening their homes to Ukrainian refugees. Brilliant. But then, why can't we? What is about us that struggle to have that reaction, or we can't put ourselves in the shoes of people who look different to us? And that's, for me, is what is really heartbreaking to me, because I know I've been checking. Everyone says, "Oh, have you got Palestinian friends or Israeli friends?" Well, I've got friends with E-Time. I'm friends with Maj. They're people. They're families. So if you were living in Gaza right now, what would you do? How would you survive? What Israel is doing in this case, because I think it's the biggest issue at the moment, is it's saying that we need to prevent attacks against Jewish people. Can't have this happen again. We want to make people safer. I don't believe that what they're doing is making anyone safer. My wife is Jewish. My daughter is Jewish. I think they are not being made safe by what's happening at all. In fact, probably the opposite. So I just really encourage people, when you're looking at conflict situations, thinking about refugees, try to think about what you would do in that situation. The lack of, I think, what I've seen, we need a bit more empathy. Like, you don't have to agree with me, anything I'm saying, but if your family were forced out of your home, where if you stayed where you were going to be killed, now whether you had to leave to the next town or to another country, the idea that is not a legitimate thing to do is crazy. And we're just very fortunate that in the UK we are not in a situation of conflict. But as you mentioned before, Belfast, Northern Ireland, that's where my mother's from. They had to leave the country there as well. So for me, I know these horrible terms like woke stuff, but it's like, can we not just get back to basic? Put yourselves in the shoes of people live in Gaza. They're people like you and me. Gaza population is one of the most educated populations in the world. Have a little bit of empathy. Try to scrutinise what's happening. Question the facts that you're told. Like you said, ask questions. Speak to experts. I think that's something I would encourage. But again, I also acknowledge the limitations by people like me. We're not always good at communicating those facts. And finally, I think one big challenge for me is that I always want to be objective to what I see and experience, and I use the law to help guide me. But sometimes there is a right, there is a wrong, there is oppression, there is systematic oppression. And you can have 2 points of view, but you can say, well, actually, yes, but there's still fundamental oppression here. Yeah. And then that's often very difficult to communicate to people, particularly when looking at Israel, the idea that a community that's been subject to so much persecution is engaging in persecution. I understand why that's a hard concept to accept.
Yeah, you need to be able to learn to hold two conflicting opinions at once.
Hamas's behaviour is awful, is atrocious, is criminal, but you can also be said that the Israeli response to that is also problematic, and there was the two legitimate and complementary position to take, whereas right now it's often seen as you either have to take one or the other, and that's of course.
Yeah, and I think reducing these, if someone has an opinion on something, reducing these absolutist mentalities, I think could be something that people can, you can think that Israel shouldn't be cutting off supplies and also not be a Holocaust denier at the same time. It's this thing where it's like, no, if you think that, then you are just totally anti-Semitic, like you were accused of being when you said that they'd potentially, you don't have to be kind of all the way in. It can just be, you can feel like that one thing's true. It doesn't mean that you're kind of put into one of these two camps. It's like you are totally like, you back Hamas or you back like the eradication of the Palestinians. Do you know what I mean? You could those two things, you can just take little bits from all of them. And I would implore anybody to do that, to make critical thinking on an individual level and informing yourself as much as possible by listening to people like yourself and people who, can give you objective viewpoints. I think is the only way to do that in a world which has become so polarized. Thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
I appreciate you coming in.
No worries.